about the purpose of the New Testament, since we left off with this at the tail end of a message a number of weeks ago. I said that basically the purpose of the New Testament is not so much to tell us about Jesus, although that ends up being there, but to complement and complete the Old Testament's picture of redemption. Everything that we find in the New Testament about Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy. So don't let me scare you off by saying, well, the New Testament isn't really just there to tell us about Jesus. I mean it in the sense that a lot of people would say, well, the Old Testament tells us about the law and the New Testament about Christ. Well, that's true, but he's the fulfillment of the law. Everything that the New Testament tells us about him has already been told to us before. It's just there in the New Testament it's being fulfilled. It's been prophesied and predicted before. Let me just mention a few things here about the important things about Jesus Christ and see if you can tell me where these are found in the Old Testament. I mean, this is what the four Gospels are about. For instance, his virgin birth, that's not new in the New Testament. That's a fulfillment of prophecy. That's as old as the Old Testament. The virgin birth, Isaiah 7, in verse 14. The fact that he would be born in Bethlehem, Micah. The fact that he would live a sinless life. He said to the Jews in John 8, which of you can convince me of sin? Where did the Old Testament prophesy that he would live a sinless life? Well, Isaiah 53, my righteous servant will bear the sins or the iniquity of many. Well, a righteous one, a sinless life. The fact that he would be betrayed by both friends and relatives. Everything about our Lord is found in the Old Testament in prophecy. Betrayal by relatives and friends. Well, Psalm 69, Psalm 41, two passages. For some of these, there are more than just one text. The fact that he would be mocked and beaten upon his arrest just prior to his crucifixion. Zechariah 12 predicts that. And what about Psalm 22? They'll look upon me whom they've pierced. That's in Zechariah, but he's been betrayed and mocked and beaten in Psalm 22. They would cast lots for his garments.
What was it in Zechariah?
Zechariah 12. That he would be vicariously killed. Well, Isaiah 53. What about that he would rise the third day? Well, the type of Jonah. And then in one package, the ascension of Christ, the outpouring of the Spirit. Well, a place like Joel 2, 28 and following, because there's a connection between his ascension and the outpouring of the Spirit, according to John 16:7. It's expedient for you that I go away. If I go not away, the Holy Spirit cannot come unto you. So there is a connection between his going away, his ascent, and the Spirit's coming, his descent. Joel 2. And then something else we could say about the purpose of the New Testament, basically what we've just given you would be found in the four Gospels, is then to tell us about the new people that God would establish, apart from and separate from Israel, the new people he would establish, whom he calls the church, and how he would deal with them. And that takes care really of the rest of the New Testament. So maybe that sounds like a lot, but if you have that down, then I think that you'd basically understand why we have the New Testament introduction, why we have the New Testament, why we have those 27 books there. It would be one thing to have all of those great and beautiful prophecies of the Messiah in the Old Testament, but it's another to have another record that records their fulfillment. The Jews are still looking for that. They've got all the prophecies, but that's never been fulfilled yet, as far as they're concerned. So we've got the prophecies, and we've got the fulfillment of those prophecies as well. Now, of course, not all of them. We've got prophecies in both covenants or testaments of the second advent and things related to that. But that's just the point. We've got prophecy, and we're going to have to wait and live those things out. Now, the next thing on our outline would be number 5. We're going to try to do numbers 5 and 6 then, which will finish big letter A, the New Testament material, tonight, by looking at the language and structure of the New Testament. And then you'll see we've got a big letter B before we really get into, and then you get over on the top of page 2, we're starting into New Testament materials. Even there it'll take us a while to get through the synoptic question, and then we'll actually get into the Gospels. So as with any other class or study, there are a few things you have to say to introduce the matter. And these are a few of these tidbits, the language and structure of the New Testament, which, if you can remember, help you understand different things about the New Testament. Let's start with language then. During the time of the New Testament, there were 4 important languages in the Roman Empire that concern us in our study of the New Testament. Now, there were many languages, but there were 4 important languages in the Roman Empire that concern us in our study of the New Testament. And those were Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. Now we're going to say a few things about each of these, and what we are after here would be the language spoken by the people in Israel and the language in which the New Testament was written, and some of the controversies surrounding that question, which was the language in which the New Testament was written, and maybe why we have some controversies in that area. So let's start with the Latin language. This was the language of the Roman courts and of classical literature in Rome. It was the legal language for jurisprudence. And primarily it was spoken in the western realm of the Roman Empire, which would be over in North Africa and in Italy and in Gaul, now called Spain. Now each of these languages that we're going to mention is not just a language that was spoken somewhere in the Roman Empire, and therefore it has some concern for us in studying New Testament material, but you actually have each of these 4 languages in the New Testament. So that makes it doubly important then. The New Testament, for instance, has about 30 what we call Latinisms. You can have Americanisms, American words that are found, transliterated into some other language or even translated. The New Testament has about 30, and these can be counted up, Latinisms, which are translated into Greek. Not transliterated, but which are translated into Greek. It's a Latin phrase or a Latin expression that if you just have the Greek, in other words, if you were only a Greek, you may not understand what the expression means, since it's a Latinism. Just like you could translate some of our popular phrases we have here in America into some other language, into equivalency of words, which doesn't mean, however, that the other people of that language that speak that language will necessarily understand that metaphor, figure of speech, or expression. Because not only do you have to know the words, maybe you got to know something about it, something about the background. I think I've used this one often before. We speak in this country of, when something really gets down to the basics and where you really have to do something about it, it's where the rubber meets the road. Well, if you're in another environment, another culture where you don't have rubber and roads and you don't have cars and tires, well, you could translate that, find some word that's a basic equivalent in that foreign tongue for rubber and road, but it doesn't mean they're going to understand what's being said. So that's what I mean by an Americanism or an Englishism. Most of these have to do with administrative and military affairs. We'll see if you know where a lot of these are here in a moment. But most of these have to do with administrative and or military affairs. The term Latin actually appears twice in the New Testament. Both of these for the superscription, concerning the superscription on the cross. In Luke 23:38 and John 19:20. the superscription. It was written in 3 languages, Jesus, King of the Jews. One of those was Latin. Well, that in itself, now that's not a Latinism, that's the actual appearance or occurrence of the term Latin itself. But that in itself would be an administrative use. This is Pontius Pilate, a Roman citizen, putting this up. Proper names appear throughout the New Testament that are Latin in origin. For instance, here's just a brief list representative of non-Christian. That is, these people were not Christians. Now, surely there were some Christians somewhere in the first century church that probably also went by these names. But these are the people, these are names of people you know in the New Testament. Agrippa, King Agrippa. Agrippa's a Latin name. Claudius, Felix, Festus, Gallio. A lot of those found in the book of Acts there. Well, I guess all of those found in the book of Acts. Agrippa, Claudius, Felix, Festus, Gallio. All of these are Latin names. And then here are some Latin names for Christians in the New Testament. Cornelius, he became a Christian. Aquila, he became one. Claudia, feminine form. Crispus, ruler of the synagogue, remember in Acts 18. Fortunatus, Julia, Junia, Junia. Now, some of those I gave you, like Cornelius and Aquila and Crispus, are found in the book of Acts. I guess those others, Claudia, Fortunatus, Julia, and Junia, are found in that interesting concluding chapter to Romans, Romans 16. You've got some of these names, I think, over here. You just got a whole list of names. Really almost the whole chapter. You see Julia like down in 15. Rufus, there's another one that's Latin in origin, verse 13. Just a whole lot of these in Romans 16. Let's say from verse 1 through verse 15. Verse 1 through 15. Then you've got some more in 20 through 23. Now, not all of those are Latin in origin. Some of those are Greek. But some of those are Latin as well. There, like in verse 7, you've got Junia. Although there's a textual question there, Junia is a feminine form. And Andronicus is the masculine form. And if what is being intended by this verse is a reference to these two as being apostles and not just people who were important in the eyes of the apostles, then the other variant would have to fit here with an S, Junius, an S on the end of it to make it a masculine. You couldn't have a feminine apostle. Although a lot of these women preachers, people, and that type of doctrine, they've made much use of this passage, Romans 16:7, without alerting you to the fact that there's a textual problem here with that name Junia. Some manuscripts have Junia, some manuscripts have Junius. But either way, we're talking about a Latin name, so we're not after the final issue there, we're just after one or the other. Both happen to be Latin. Now, I said a moment ago that the New Testament has about 30 Latinisms. So which book would you guess? Here you'll have a New Testament question, you see, to see how well you know this, and you may not know it. That's why we're studying it, I guess. But which book would you guess has probably the largest, proportionally speaking, number of Latinisms? Well, Revelation, anybody, or Matthew, or 2 Timothy? I haven't heard it yet. Now, Acts, I thought would be everybody's first guess. Mark's Gospel. So you don't know something about Mark's Gospel. Whenever we get to that, you'll understand why. And we tie Mark's Gospel in with a reference Peter makes over in 1 Peter chapter 5, and then you'll understand some things. Mark's Gospel probably proportionally has the largest number of Latinisms in it. You'll understand that better when we study Mark's Gospel. Okay, and then secondly, after Latin, we would come to Aramaic. Now, this was the native tongue of the Near Eastern people. Everybody in ancient Babylonia, Syria, Palestine, all the various surrounding nations, the Near Eastern people, the Levant. This was the native tongue there. Sometimes it's called Chaldee in the Old Testament. That's because the KJV translators didn't know what to do with it. It's called Chaldee. Or sometimes it's called Syriac, like in, I think, Daniel 2:4. Syriac. But really all that is Aramaic. Now back whenever we taught you a little bit, introductory class anyway, to Biblical Hebrew, we discussed a lot about these languages, especially Aramaic and Hebrew. So I don't need to go over that again. Just suffice it to say that Aramaic displaced Hebrew as the national language of the Jews after the return of the exiles, which I would assume you would basically know and remember anyway. It displaced Hebrew as the national language of the Jews after the return of the exiles. It's not called Hebrew, it's called the lip of Canaan, or the language of the Jews in the Old Testament, but that was Hebrew back then. But then that was replaced by Aramaic. Some Aramaic words in the New Testament. And if you ask me, well, how would I know, what's Aramaic in origin versus Latin versus Hebrew versus Greek? Well, you really wouldn't know. I mean, I can't tell you it's going to have a certain spelling or a certain ending. Sometimes, if you know enough, you can kind of have a feel. That sounds like it would be, but then that's not always reliable either. You can turn over to Romans 16 and try to guess, now, which is Latin and which is Greek. And your guessing, mine as included, will not always work if you don't already know. But a couple of Aramaic terms would be that place called Bethesda. Bethesda in John 5, that pool of Bethesda is Aramaic. Or the field that Luke speaks of in Acts 1, known as the field of Akeldama. Aceldama. KJV may have a soft C pronunciation, Aceldama there, but Akeldama. Bethesda and Akeldama. Now, Akeldama will become important for us later on this evening. That's Acts 1. Don't worry about it now. We'll turn over there in a little while. Those are Aramaic terms, as well as many, many, many more. There are Aramaic names and just a host of things. Then thirdly, the language of Hebrew. Basically, only those within the rabbinical circles would speak and read Hebrew. And this was confined to their theological discussions, much in the way that the Latin language was used by the Roman Catholic Church for so many centuries. It was kind of a holy language. It was a liturgical language for them. Hebrew became that, a liturgical language. And it's probably impossible to speculate who spoke Hebrew besides the rabbis. Only in Revelation 9:11 and 16:16 does the word really mean Hebrew proper. KJV, in other words, gives us Hebrew on several different occasions. For instance, some in John and a lot over in the book of Acts, where really what is meant, it's a different spelling of the word, what is really meant there is Aramaic and not Hebrew. But when you get to the book of Revelation, anytime that word appears, it appears in a different form, and it always means the language of Hebrew. I mean, Hebrew proper. Hebrew as you've studied it, Hebrew. Revelation 9:11. They had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon. But then he gives his Greek name as well. Now that Hebrew should be just like it is, Hebrew. And then in 16:16, more famous reference than that one, he gathered them together in a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. Armageddon, the valley of Megiddo. Or some people pronounce it the valley of Megiddo, but that's just the English pronunciation. The valley of Megiddo, Armageddon. In all of the other passages where Hebrew occurs in the KJV, Aramaic is in fact meant. In all the other passages, in other words, anything outside of the book of Revelation in the New Testament, where the KJV translators gave us Hebrew, referring to a language. What is really meant is Aramaic. For instance, Luke 23:38, I gave you that before because Latin appears there. John 5, this will help because of what I've just said under point 2, the second language, Aramaic. John 5, verse 2, now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool which is called in the Aramaic tongue Bethesda. Bethesda is not a Hebrew word, it's an Aramaic word. So since we already know that, we already know the origin of Bethesda, it's Aramaic, then that helps us to understand Hebrew should be Aramaic here, besides the spelling of the term, which is called in the Aramaic tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. And then those other references would be John 19:13, as well as verses 17 and 20. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in the Aramaic, Gabbatha. Gabbatha is Aramaic. John 19:13. Then in verse 17, and he bearing his cross went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Aramaic Golgotha. By the way, what's Calvary? Calvary is another term. What's Calvary? That's Latin. So see, we could have stuck that up under Latin. Calvary is a Latin word, not a Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic. Calvary is a Latin term. Golgotha is an Aramaic term. Verse 20, we mentioned in Acts 21:40, Paul speaks to them in the Aramaic tongue. He's been arrested. He's up on the stairs leading to the fortress of Antonia, and he speaks out to them in Aramaic. And then in chapter 22 and verse 2, and when they heard that he spake in the Aramaic tongue to them, they kept the more silence. You know, you can really identify with someone when you speak in their language. You go overseas, for instance, and you go as an American, as a typical American, we know all of one language in the United States, and that's English. Most other places of the world, you can find an uneducated person. He probably knows at least 2 languages and probably 3. You can go all over Europe and they can speak several languages. And we can have a lot more education they have and only speak 1. It's because we've got that superiority attitude. Well, I can go anywhere and expect those people to speak in my language. You go over there and talk to them in their language, they'll really respect that. They'll respect you much more than a person coming over expecting them in their own homeland and country to change languages and talk to you from the other side of the Atlantic. My father-in-law is very busy in the practice right now of teaching himself German. He used to live in Germany in the military years ago, and he could speak it then, and he's lost some of that, and he's very good in German. He can speak German very well. And whenever they were over in Germany last year, he would speak in German. People will respond to you, the Germans, right away. They can tell you're not a German. I mean, you'll never speak German like a German will. They can tell you're some foreigner. But you talk in their language. And immediately you have a rapport with them. They think more highly of you because they see you're not expecting them to lower themselves to your level or raise themselves up to your level, as we would think. Then in 26:14, Book of Acts, chapter 26 and verse 14. I think this is Paul's last occasion of reciting his testimony, and this heavenly voice came to him. I heard a voice speaking unto me, saying in the Aramaic tongue, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Good old oxen Near Eastern metaphor, to kick against the pricks. There again, that's not so much, an Hebraism or something, but it's a Near Eastern metaphor, kicking against the prick. You'd have to understand that to understand what the Lord is saying to him. Acts 26:14. So Jesus could speak Aramaic. Well, obviously, he was born and reared in Palestine. He should be able to. So Hebrew is only found in the book of Revelation. And then our 4th language would be the language of Greek. You should know a lot about this already. The conquest of Alexander the Great, the end of the 4th century BC, calls Greek to be the cultural language of the whole world of New Testament times. People in Palestine could speak Greek as well as Aramaic. Turn back to an interesting reference in chapter 21 of the book of Acts and verse 37 and 38. Now, evidently, Claudius Lysias, who's in control of the cohort stationed, the Roman soldiers at the fortress of Antonia, cannot speak Aramaic. All he knows is that this man Paul has done something to cause an uproar in the temple, so much so that the Jews were going to have him executed. And it took them coming into verse 32 for them to leave off beating Paul. And so, he asked, well, what's going on? Well, verse 34, some cried one thing and some cried another, and so Paul was going to be torn apart, and he had to be lifted up, the apostle, on the shoulders of the soldiers, verse 35, to get out of the way of the people. And so verse 37, as Paul was led into the fortress, literally, he said unto the chief captain, Claudius Lysias, may I speak unto thee? Now Paul said that, he didn't say, may I speak unto thee? That's English. May I speak unto thee? Lysias said to him, canst thou speak Greek? Well, that proves Paul could speak Greek. But look what his expectations of Paul were. Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar and led us out into the wilderness, 4,000 men that were murderers and so forth? He was surprised, and he finds out that Paul happens to be a Jew of the province of Tarsus in the city of Cilicia. So there's someone who could speak Greek all over the Roman Empire. The writings of the New Testament, as we have them, are in Greek, a form of Greek known as Koine, Koine, which is not some special language of the Holy Ghost, but which was the common form of Greek versus the classical form. There is some difference between the two forms. A lot is similar. First time around I had Greek in a formal setting of higher education, it was classical. And the second time I had Greek, second go around, was Koine. And so there's a lot of things that are the same, but there are some things that are different as well. The writings of Luke and the writings of Paul have a very high literary quality. You might have guessed Paul, I don't know if you would have guessed Luke or not, but Luke and Acts are better Greek, in other words, than Matthew, Mark, and John. There are three other books that stand out in the New Testament. Besides the writings of Paul and the writings of Luke, there are three other books that stand out in the New Testament as having a very high form of Greek. I mean, it's still Koine, but it's excellent, fluent, beautiful Greek. Which three books do you think that might be? Three other books. One you should guess. Maybe two you wouldn't. And two are what are going to prove something to be interesting later on. Hebrews definitely is a very high and beautiful form. It's made some people think that either Luke or Paul wrote it. It's a very high and beautiful form of Greek. Well, besides Luke in writings. No, not Revelation. No. I think I heard both of them. First Peter. Peter, the fisherman, is a very high form of Greek. Let's say much better than John's writings. Well, they were both fishermen. Better than Matthew's writings. Matthew was a professional. He was a tax collector. He knew how to write. First Peter is very good Greek. What would be your question after that? What about Second Peter? Yes. What about it? Well, as you see, when we get to Petrine writings, Peter didn't write Second Peter, so say the critical scholars, because the Greek doesn't compare. First Peter is very good. Second Peter is not very good. you start thinking about that on your way, and we'll see how we can explain that. And the other book that I heard, James, little epistle of James, the very good form of Greek. So it's not 5 books, but those, we'll say 5 authors: Luke, Paul, Hebrews, 1 Peter, and James. They have high literary quality as Koine Greek. Many of the Old Testament quotations in the New Testament are from the Septuagint, which means they are from Greek. Luke's writings and the book of Hebrews especially take all their quotations from the Septuagint rather than from some other form, which we would assume would be a Masoretic origin. In other words, a Hebrew origin versus a Greek origin. Now, those are the 4 important languages. A small selection of words from other language backgrounds are also found in the New Testament. But these are not very important. Such as, I'll just give you one example, the word paradise. I think I've told you this before. What's the language origin of that word, paradise? Persian. That's a Persian word. And it's been picked up by the Jews and carried right over into the Bible itself. This day you'll be with me in paradise, Jesus said. That's a Persian origin. And what most people want to do is find out which people spoke which languages. I said earlier it's impossible to be dogmatic about that. Most probably, though, Paul could speak all 4 of the above languages.
For the continued
Most probably, though, Paul could speak all 4 of the above languages. He was from a Greek province, so he could speak Greek. He was born that way. However, he was a Jew raised in Palestine, so he said in his own testimony, so he could speak Aramaic. He was trained in theological circles, so he could speak Hebrew. And he did a lot of traveling over in Gaul and Italy, which we would tend to deduce from that he could speak Latin as well. That's quite an accomplishment, to speak 4 languages fluently. Paul probably could. Although it would be more of an accomplishment for you to be able to speak 4. He was raised in the environment, you see, different times of his life, and you pick those things up naturally. When you start out, I'm going to learn 4 languages between, now and 4 years from now. Then that would be an accomplishment. Jesus could probably speak 3 of them. It's doubtful that he would speak Latin, because where would he have learned Latin? Who would he have been around for him to pick up Latin? The other apostles, Aramaic and Greek certainly, and we just don't know about the others, whether they also knew Hebrew from theological associations they had over the years, whether they picked up Latin, traveling all over the world as apostles, we don't know. But I'd just give you those 3 examples, going from 4 down to 3, down to 2. Paul could speak 4, Jesus 3, the other apostles, 2, perhaps more. Now, let's come to a question. The reason we've looked at this language background is to raise one question. And you say, when you see the question on the outline, I already know the answer to that. Maybe you don't know why other people don't know the answer to that. So it would be important for you to realize that. And that is the question, in which language was the New Testament originally composed? In which language was the New Testament originally composed? Now, I could just start spouting off talking about it. But rather than do that, that's difficult to take notes from. Let me be real precise by giving you the critical view, or the higher critical view, the liberal view, in other words, and the conservative view. And then I'll give you reasons for the liberal versus the conservative. That is, why people who hold the liberal view hold such a view. And it may not seem so liberal to you after all. A lot of people have followed this. Critical view is that the New Testament was originally composed in Aramaic. That the New Testament was originally composed in Aramaic. And here are some of their reasons for believing this. Number one, early church tradition has it that perhaps Matthew first wrote his gospel in a Semitic tongue, either Hebrew or Aramaic. One of the early church writers, Pias, as we'll see when we start discussing Matthew and Mark, has a quote that any New Testament book that's even of survey material, I mean even on the level of New Testament survey, not New Testament introduction, will always invariably give you this quote, because a lot hinges on the statement from this early church writer. What did he really mean with what he said? Now we think we know what he said, but there are different ways to translate it. He wrote in another language, not in English, so we have to translate what he said, and then what did he mean by what he said? So the critics have this on their side, at least they feel that they do, that according to early, very, very early church tradition, some people have it that Matthew wrote his gospel first in a Semitic language, and then it was secondly and later translated into Greek. And there's other early church tradition that some of the New Testament materials first came out in Aramaic. So you could just say early church tradition, but particularly concerning Matthew's gospel. We have a specific direct reference concerning Matthew's gospel. And then secondly, in support of this view, they argue that it would only be natural to write in Aramaic since that was the language of Palestine. Everyone in Palestine could speak Aramaic. And not only could they speak it, that was their native, natural tongue. Greek was something that was imported, spread out through the empire and imported, and Aramaic was just a natural tongue. That which had replaced Hebrew with the return of the exiles. So that sounds very logical. Makes a lot of sense there, that it would only be natural to write in Aramaic since that's where you are in Palestine. And then a third argument, the New Testament contains vestiges of the original Aramaic. Not only Aramaic, names, you couldn't help that, Bethesda, Keldama. How else are you going to say Jerusalem? How can you say Jerusalem in English, but Jerusalem? So place names would be no problem. Well, what about other words and phrases that are found that are just left in the Aramaic? One good example is the Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani of Matthew 27:46. That's Aramaic. Now we have an English translation, of course, but that is just left transliterated for us. Now that doesn't mean anything to you as an English person. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That's all just left there. And we're not talking about terms in Aramaic that became catch terms like Maranatha, which is an Aramaic word. We're talking about an entire sentence there that's in Aramaic. So in other words, the argument is that was how Matthew's whole gospel was originally. It was originally in Aramaic. And then later somebody translated it into some other language, notably Greek, and then later that was translated into English. All right, then the conservative view is, of course, that the New Testament was originally written in Greek. And you may want to take note of the reasons why conservatives hold this view. They have three reasons as well. In the first place, they would argue, and I include myself under this conservative viewpoint, that by the time, especially of later New Testament books, and I mean, let's face it, all of them are later, in the sense of they don't come during the life of Christ or the first few years of the church. They're all coming, let's just round it off and say, in the second half of the first century A.D. So by the time of later New Testament books, much of the church was Gentile. What does that prove? Well, the deduction is the Gentiles couldn't speak Aramaic. but they could speak Greek. Everyone all over the empire could speak Greek. So let's just, we could pick any book. Let's pick Mark's, or let's pick Luke's, or Paul's epistles. If we're talking about books that are coming on the scene anywhere from 20 to 30 years after the founding of the church, we know what happens. The church quickly moves out of Jerusalem. A large proportion of the church moves out, and the church as such, universal, is established all over the empire. Down in Egypt, up in Asia Minor, in Italy. Now, are you going to be writing all of your New Testament materials in a language that is restricted to the people of the Middle East or the Near East? When you're writing to people in Italy or Gaul or wherever, you're going to have to write in the tongue they can understand, unless you're writing just so someone else could translate. But who's to say there's going to be a person in the local church at Ephesus who can speak Aramaic, if you're sending your epistle to the Ephesians in Aramaic rather than in Greek? Secondly, the church very quickly moved out of Palestine to Gentile lands. We've got Gentile people, the first point, and it's quickly moving out into Gentile lands. In other words, you would ask yourself this question: which of the New Testament books was addressed to a group of people living in Israel? Which of the New Testament books was addressed to a group of people living in Israel? Well, it certainly couldn't be Romans, or Corinthians, or Ephesians, or Colossians, or Philippians, or Thessalonians. You just go down the list almost. They're always out somewhere else. Now, you may have a few that could have been addressed to people in Israel, but they would be in the minority, that's for sure. And in the third place, and this type of argument, or this type of proof or reason, to me, it can't be gainsaid. And until you have evidence otherwise, or to the contrary, it's safe to stay with the obvious. And that is, no Aramaic copies have ever been found. So that's quite a hypothesis to say that it was originally, because what you're saying, it was originally written in Aramaic, but all of that was destroyed. And now what we have are Greek copies. Now we know we don't even have the Greek autographs, or whatever language it was, we have copies of that. Well, why not some Aramaic copies of the Aramaic autographs? Or some Aramaic copies of the Greek autographs? We have different languages in which it is found, but we have basically Greek manuscripts. Not a single copy of an Aramaic manuscript has been found. So that's an incredible hypothesis to just dream that up and say, well, this is the way that it is, when we don't have any support for that except some of your logic. You're saying, well, logically it would make sense since you're in Palestine, you're writing to people in Palestine. That was their second proof or argument or point of view. But that doesn't really hold any water, as I just said. How many times were they writing either to or from Palestine? That would certainly be in the minority. I mean, where was Matthew when he wrote his gospel? We can't just automatically say Israel. Where was he? He's writing years later. Where was he? Had he moved away? Paul certainly moved away. Where was Peter? Well, Peter tells us he's not in Israel whenever he's writing. Where was John when he did his writing? Church tradition tells us he was in Ephesus and he wasn't in Israel. Who was left in Israel? The apostles stayed there originally. The apostles leave later on. Where was Mark? We think we know where Mark was when he wrote his. Where was Luke whenever they wrote? And to whom did they write? Where were those people? You basically have a non-Israel, a non-Palestine situation here for both author and recipient of most of the New Testament books. So it would be absurd to assume that they were originally written in Aramaic. So you might say, well, why even have the issue? Why even have the question? What is the point to it? Well, the point to it for the critical scholars is several-fold, but basically the vestiges in the New Testament of an original Aramaic, as far as they are concerned. Now, I'll give you what I quoted over in Matthew 27. You may want to turn and look at that. Matthew 27 and verse 46. Matthew 27:46, where we certainly do have an Aramaic phrase. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. As I say, you've got other Aramaic terms. In 1 Corinthians 16, Maranatha is an Aramaic word. Well, that had probably become a catch term, an early part of early Christian vocabulary. Just like what? Well, like we say hallelujah. We don't translate that into English, praise the Lord. But just because, in other words, if I wrote you a letter and it was just written in English and then I, had interspersed in there a few hallelujahs, and someone's reading that later, 100 or 2,000 years from now, are they going to look at those words, hallelujah, and say, I know this letter was originally written in Hebrew? Just because I have a few Hebrew words in there? No, that's become a catch term, part of Christian vocabulary, although it's a foreign word, hallelujah. The same is true with Maranatha. The scholars don't use that. Maranatha, they would know, had become a catch term, part of early Christian vocabulary. And so you're not going to try to render that in Greek or something. You're going to leave it right in Aramaic, Maranatha. Another good example of a catch term was the term mammon. In Matthew 6:24, that's an Aramaic term, mammon. Well, we use that today in English, mammon. I mean, even the media, they will use that. Then do we say, I bet they originally broadcast that thing in Aramaic because I heard that term mammon. Well, no, that's just a common accepted word. But they say, what about whole sentences like this? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Well, the conservative, and this is pretty interesting, to me anyway it is. I don't know if it'll be to you, but to me it is, and we can't get into what the implications would be, but the conservative view is that phrases such as these are left in the original way they were spoken, not written, for emphasis' sake. In other words, the conservative view would hold that Matthew wrote his gospel in Greek. Whenever he came to this phrase, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, remembering what Christ had said on the cross, having been told by someone else or however he got the information, then he simply transliterated that rather than translating that. I mean, he goes on to say, that is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But why even leave the Aramaic in there? He goes on he transliterates that in Greek, but rather than translating it there and then leaving out that second translation into Greek, he leaves it that way for emphasis' sake. Left the spoken Aramaic words just as they had been uttered. When Jesus went around teaching people, he didn't teach in Greek, he taught in Aramaic. And so whenever Matthew or Mark or Luke or John, one of them happens to be recording what Jesus said, they're not really giving us what he said. He spoke in Aramaic, they're writing in Greek. They're having to translate, and you're going to lose something in the translation there. They're having to translate from Aramaic over into Greek. But on occasions such as this, they simply choose to leave it that way for emphasis' sake. I mean, he didn't have to put that in there. In other words, well, let's just find anything. I don't know if you're following me. Go back to chapter 26 and verse 45. Why did Matthew, in other words, why did Matthew do this? Verse 45 of Matthew 26. Then cometh he to his disciples and saith unto them, now I don't know what sleep on now, how you would say that in Aramaic. But why didn't he just write that in Aramaic and then say, that is, sleep on now, and give us a translation? Jesus did say sleep on now in Aramaic, not in Greek. Throughout the gospel, you'd have to have, after every single sentence, you'd have to say, that is, give the Aramaic transliterated, that is, and give the Greek translation. He doesn't do that. He only does it here in verse 46. There has to be a reason why then. You see, the critical scholars jump in and say, well, that proves that it was originally written in Aramaic. But that proves no such thing. I think that it would tend to prove just the opposite, by virtue of the fact he's going on to translate that. Or I can give you another example, Galatians chapter 4. Galatians 4 and verse 6. Because ye are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying. Now, Paul, writing in Greek to people up in Galatia, they couldn't speak Aramaic. These are Gentiles in Galatia. God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Well, you've got two different Greek words here. First of all, or two different words. One Aramaic, one Greek. That's what it looks like in your Greek New Testament. Abba, ho pater. Father, Father. Or what the two words mean. One in Greek, first in Aramaic, the second in Greek. One in Aramaic, one in Greek. But that term, Abba, is a different term. It means father, but it has a much, there's much more familiarity, let's say, in the term Abba than pater, the Greek term. And so what Paul does, that also has become a term that the early Christians are using. Abba, or Abba, it's found in Romans chapter 8 as well. Rather than giving us translation, so we've got pater, pater, father, father. In essence, what you have is father, father. You've got Abba, father, father, father. But you've got one Aramaic, the other Greek. So Paul is trying to say something through that. He could have just said father, father in Greek, or he could have just said father. I mean, why even duplicate it to begin with? He says father, pater, but he says Abba to begin with. So the conservative view would be that these things are left there for emphasis' sake. Surely he could have said everything he said in the book of Galatians in Aramaic. But when you write it in Greek and then put a few things or leave a few things in Aramaic in it, it tends to bring emphasis to that. Of course, I would say that it's much more true in the Gospels than you'd find elsewhere, since Paul is writing in Greek to Greek people, whereas in the New Testament we're dealing with Aramaic material, that is, as it was originally spoken. The writing of it is in Greek. There is where the difference occurs. Okay, I better go on quickly then to the structure of the New Testament. I'm going to deal with this under two heads. First of all, the content of the New Testament, and then, if we have time, the arrangement of the books. If we don't, we'll do that second part later. The content of the New Testament. The content. And I just don't think we'll even get to that third literary nature thing. Okay, we have 27 books. The content, 27 books, 260 chapters, 7,957 verses. Here are your test questions. What's the longest book in the New Testament? Luke. What's the shortest book? 2 John. What's the longest chapter? Luke 1. What's the shortest chapter? No, not 2 John. That'd be shortest chapter and shortest book. There's a chapter shorter than that book. That's a short book. Longest book, shortest book. Longest chapter, Luke 1. Shortest chapter, 1 Thessalonians 1. It's only just a few verses there. Earliest book written? James. Latest book? Revelation. All right, 5 out of 6 questions. Pretty good score. You'll remember shortest chapter now, 1 Thessalonians 1. Arrangement of the books. The arrangement of the New Testament books. That is the way we have them in the English canon of Scripture. It's not done chronologically. It's done according to subject matter, with three divisions of subject matter, namely narrative, epistolatory, and apocalyptic. The narratives, the epistles, and the apocalypse. Narrative, epistolatory, apocalyptic. Narrative would be the first 5 books. This is the way we have them in the New Testament, and why we have them this way. It's not inspired, but it's for convenience sake according to subject matter. First 5 books are narrative. The first 4 of those deal with the life of Christ: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The 5th, or the last narrative book in the New Testament, deals with the first 3 decades of the early church, the book of Acts. So if I were to ask you what are the narrative books in the New Testament, then you'd have to know the first 5, Matthew through Acts. 4 dealing with the life of Christ, and 1 with the first 3 decades of the early church. Then epistles, this is where it becomes interesting. Epistles, how many epistles are there? Quickly, don't count. 21. 21 books in the New Testament are epistolatory. That's kind of an easy number to remember. 21 is kind of a coming-of-age number in this country. So 21. That would be Romans through Jude. Notice that they're right there together. You don't have like Romans and then 2 narratives and then 3 epistles and the final narratives and so forth. You've got narratives first, they're all placed together, then all 21 epistles from Romans to Jude. Here you have 14 by Paul, or 13, depending on what you want to do with the book of Hebrews. You have 1 by James, 2 by Peter, 3 by John, 1 by Jude, and if you give Paul 13, then we have 1 by an unknown, the book of Hebrews. So you'd have Paul, James, Peter, John, Jude, Hebrews. All of Paul's come first, even if you include Hebrews with him. All of Paul's come first. Why are Paul's together? What's the structure of Paul's epistles and their arrangement? Well, there are a couple of different suggestions why we have it this way in the English canon. Some people feel that it's according to their descending order of length. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but you go Romans and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. They're descending order of length. And what do you end with for Paul's epistles? Philemon, little tiny 1-chapter Philemon. You start with big Romans of 16 chapters, you go down to little Philemon of 1. So it's in descending order of their length. One exception, however, to that theory, if that's why, no one really knows why they were originally put that way. One exception would be Galatians and Ephesians would have to be swapped. In other words, Ephesians is actually longer than Galatians. Now these are little tidbits that make you know the New Testament. I mean, you could still know doctrine, what the New Testament is about, and not know this, but this helps you get a grasp on New Testament materials, let's say. Ephesians is longer than Galatians, and yet it follows Galatians. So that wouldn't work with this theory, because this theory would have to have Galatians either longer or Ephesians preceding Galatians. And then if you accept Hebrews as being one of Paul's, and that too is an exception. That's a long book. One of Paul's long is found at the very end of his corpus of material. But a whole lot of people don't accept that as Pauline. So if that isn't Pauline, then we have a fairly good theory here, with the exception of Galatians and Ephesians, of descending order of length from Romans through Corinthians all the way down through Thessalonians and Timothy down to Titus and then finally Philemon. Others, however, feel that Paul's epistles are set up according to their recipients. And I might add, while you're writing that, others feel it's a combination of these two. Others feel that it's according to the recipients. What I mean by that is this. The first 9 of Paul's 13 are sent to churches. And the next 4 to individuals. And then the reason, those 9 are in that order, rather than some order in the 9, would be back to the first suggestion of descending order of length. And the reason those 4 in that order are same cause. But you've got 9 to churches, Romans through Thessalonians. You've got 4 to individuals, Timothy, 1 and 2, Titus, and Philemon. You don't have that many books, only 27 in the New Testament. You ought to be able to get a handle on these things and kind of be able to throw all of that around. Remember which book comes before which, and you got 9 church letters together, and then 4 individual letters together, and so forth. Then finally we've got apocalyptic, which would be the book of Revelation. Epistles, I think, would be the most interesting because you have so many of them, 21. And you have to get them, you have to think of why they're arranged. Was there a particular reason, or did they just do it in some haphazard fashion? Let me just quickly do literary nature. I think we can probably get this all on tape. The literary nature, and that's the final thing that I'll be saying about the structure or about the New Testament material. The literary nature. B was arrangement. Literary nature. We first of all have historical books. 5 historical books which tell us the history of the unique account of Jesus and his early followers. Now that would just so happen to match the narrative books under arrangement. It won't always be true that we'll match under literary nature what we did under arrangement. 5 historical books that tell us the unique account of the history of Jesus and his early followers. Then we often hear that there are 15 doctrinal books. 15 doctrinal books. These deal with either large or small doctrinal issues. We don't have the time to let you list them, so let me just run through them. Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st John, and Jude. Then thirdly, under literary nature, we have 6 personal books. These would be letters to an individual. 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, 2nd and 3rd John. And then finally you have one that is prophetic, and that's the book of Revelation.